Meanwhile, the left-wing attempt, racially speaking, to blame everything on white supremacy continues apace. Michael Eric Dyson, who is a grifter of the highest order, a pseudo-intellectual who speaks on race on a frequent basis on your TV, he suggests that pretty much everything he doesn't like is an aspect of white supremacy. So here he was yesterday explaining that white supremacy governs literally every political position. He said this while speaking to Mark Lamont Hill, who has in the past trafficked in severe anti-Semitism. Here is Michael Eric Dyson.
Do we have any reason not to expect a similar surge?
No. In fact, the opposite is true. It can be predicted with reasonable confidence that a similar surge will occur. That, when you're trying to catch one of these Lyfts or Ubers and you're dealing with the surge, and during the surge you pay more, that's what we pay more. We pay more during the surges of Trump and white nationalism. We pay in terms of political capital that's precious to us. We pay in terms of lives lost. We pay in terms of an erosion of the American spirit. We pay in the refusal to acknowledge that white supremacy is the ultimate arbiter of truth in our political scene.
So the rule here is that everything I don't like is an aspect of white supremacy, and all the systems are controlled by white supremacy. Now, this is now translated over into the debate over anti-Semitism, because we have seen a repeated and ugly reiteration of anti-Semitism coming from prominent members of the black community. We're talking Kanye West. We're talking some Kyrie Irving here. We are talking about a wide variety of people in sort of public life who have been engaging in, at the very least, things that border on anti-Semitism. Now, some of the things that are called anti-Semitism aren't. If you criticize Jared Kushner because you don't like his politics, that's not anti-Semitism. If you say that George Soros is a bad political donor who pursues bad causes in the United, that's not anti-Semitism either. If you say the Jews control Hollywood, that is anti-Semitism, because that's a conspiracy theory about Jews getting together Friday nights at the synagogue and trying to figure out exactly how to deprive, apparently, according to black people of their ability to make a living. Right? That is anti-Semitism, blaming the Jews. Now, if Kanye had called out, for example, an individual Jewish agent and said, this guy is bad, that wouldn't be a slur against the Jews any more than it would be a slur against black Americans generally to say, this black American committed a crime. And it's not the same thing as saying the blacks are responsible for crime. That would be a racist sentiment. It would imply a plan, it would imply coordination. But there's no question that anti-Semitism, at least public anti-Semitism, seems to be rising inside areas of the black community. Everybody is noticing this, including Michael Eric Dyson. He has a piece over at the New York Times talking about this today. He says that blacks and Jews are at it again, essentially. And here is how he doesn't like anti-Semitism, but only a particular species of anti-Semitism. What he says is not that anti-Semitism is bad across the board. What he says is that anti-Semitism is a species of white supremacy. So essentially, only white people can be anti-Semitic. He says, until we see anti-Semitism as a toxic species of the white supremacy that threatens black security and democracy's future, none of us are truly safe. So he says blacks and Jews should be united against anti-Semitism, mainly because anti-Semitism is a form of white supremacy. But that's not really all what anti-Semitism is. And the problem is when you redefine all bad things in the world as white supremacy, it lets people off the hook who are not white supremacists. He says, all Jews, regardless of wealth, are threatened by the vicious anti-Semitism that has been spread in dangerous networks of white supremacy. Now, white supremacists are in fact anti-Semitic. But when we talk about anti-Semitism, which according to the widely cited on the left Anti-Defamation League, is particularly prominent among black Americans by poll data. When we're talking about that, that's not a form of white supremacy. It's not black Americans who are now engaged in white supremacy. And here is the problem. When you make that argument, you start to make the argument that the Jews kind of deserve it. Why? Because if you say that anti-Semitism is a form of white supremacy, and you also say, as Michael Eric Dyson does, that Jews are quote unquote white adjacent, then the idea is that if you are anti-white supremacy, namely anti-whiteness, that being against the Jews who are white adjacent, well, that's not all that far-fetched, is it? He says the relation of African Americans to Jews cannot be divorced from the pervasive glow-ended lure and privilege of whiteness. The fact that most Jews are white eligible and African Americans are white excluded creates tensions between African Americans and many Jews that have less to do with the cultural conflicts between the groups than with the meaning of blackness and whiteness in America. Now, Michael Eric Dyson doesn't make it super clear what he's talking about, but P. Diddy, put out a video on his Instagram that does make it fairly clear what this argument is. And it's a pretty ugly argument. We'll get to more on this in just 1 second. First, folks, do you feel like you ever don't get the respect you deserve? Well, there's one way you can get that respect right quick, and that is established titles. Established titles is your opportunity to earn the title of laird or lady and gain the respect you deserve. All you need is 1 square foot plot of land in Scotland. Established titles is a project based on a historic Scottish custom where landowners are referred to as lairds, or lords and ladies in English. In your title pack, you will be bestowed with at least 1 square foot of dedicated land on a private estate in Edelston, Scotland, plus an official certificate with a crest. Your certificate features a unique plot number with which you can see the exact location of your land. I, for example, am already a lord. I have a plot of land over in Edelston, Scotland, and here is my certificate to prove it. This is now my pronoun. Titles packs from established titles are a fun and unique gift for any occasion. There are even couples packs that come with adjoining plots of land for that special someone in your life. With your certificate, you could officially add the prefix of Lord or Lady to your credit cards, plane tickets, even your dating profiles. Plus, established titles commits to preserving the woodlands not only in Scotland but around the planet. They have partnerships with global charities like One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future to help with our afforestation efforts, and for every order they receive, a tree is planted. And get this, Established Titles told me the first 200 people purchasing a title pack using my exclusive link receive a plot within a few walking minutes of my own over in Shapiro stand. So, depending on how many of you want to become a lord or lady, we can build our own kingdom. And from there, we only spread our tentacles outward. Established Titles is actually running a massive sale right now. Plus, if you use code BEN, you get an additional 10% off. Go to establishedtitles.com/Ben. Get your gifts right now. Help support the channel. So here is the video from P. Diddy on anti-Semitism. At least he didn't make it, but he put it up on his page, talking about the conflict between blacks and Jews with regard to anti-Semitism. The basic argument here is that so long as blacks and Jews were part of an intersectional coalition against whiteness, then anti-Semitism was bad. But once there are Jews who are not progressive in their politics, once there are Jews who do not see the only form of anti-Semitism as white supremacy, then targeting Jews might be kind of okay. Here is the argument that was put up on P. Diddy's page.
So what happened to relations between the black and Jewish communities? Now, I want to first acknowledge that it is possible to be both black and Jewish, since Judaism is a religion, and like blackness, being Jewish is also a cultural marker. But for the purposes of this conversation, we'll focus on Jewish people who identify as white. Historically, black and Jewish people have been natural allies. There is a common history of extreme persecution and triumph in the midst of adversity. And for a while, these commonalities seem to create a natural alliance between the two groups. But there's a general feeling that relations between the two groups began to sour in the late 1960s. The Jewish people were now representatives of the American dream. They were an immigrant success story. But by the late 1960s, the United States, and specifically the black community, was becoming more aware of the Palestinian struggle. It was only a matter of time before the Nation of Islam began to loudly assert that Jewish people in America were complicit in the oppression of Palestinians. And black folks identified with that struggle. Now, there are two realities that we need to be able to hold simultaneously. Number one, the Jewish people belong to an historically marginalized group that has been systematically persecuted for simply existing for thousands of years. And number two, for the last 70 years, Jewish people have been a part of the dominant racial caste in the U.S. and therefore are able to participate in and perpetuate white supremacy.
Okay, stop. Okay, that right there is the key point, right? The idea is, yes, there can be anti-Semitism, but only by white supremacists, because Jews are basically white adjacent. This is all intersectional hierarchy nonsense. The idea that Jews can only be victimized by anti-Semitism if it comes from white supremacy, that's garbage. Because this is, in fact, an implicitly anti-Semitic argument. The idea here is that as long as the Jews are white adjacent, and as long as the Jews are disproportionately successful financially, and as long as the state of Israel exists, that's an amazing argument, that the state of Israel existing basically creates an excuse to be anti-Semitic, because now you can be complicit in the Palestinian anti-Semitism that calls for the complete obliteration of the state of Israel. And this is not a form of anti-Semitism anymore. It's a form of anti-white supremacy because the Jews are white adjacent. That is the argument that's being made. You think that foments anti-Semitism or undercuts anti-Semitism? The idea here that the anti-Semitism is only bad depending on who does it actually incentivizes anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is not a species of anti-whiteness. First of all, anti-whiteness is bad in and of itself, in the same way that anti-blackness is bad. There should be not any anti-the group. Anti-the group is bad. Virtually always. So the argument that you are anti-whiteness itself is a problem. In the same way that it would be a huge problem to say you're anti-blackness. Okay, but when you say that Jews are a part of the dominant racial caste in the United States and therefore are able to participate in and perpetuate white supremacy, what you are now saying is that if you call out the Jews as white supremacists, then you are actually fighting anti-Semitism. Right? If you're calling out the Jews as members of the white supremacist coterie, you're not engaged in anti-Semitism because, after all, only white supremacists can be anti-Semitic. You have immunized yourself from charges of anti-Semitism. So it's not possible for you to be anti-Semitic. And you see this sort of argument being made on a routine basis by people who are proclaiming anti-Semitic crap all the time. I'm not being anti-Semitic, after all. I'm just talking about Jews who are white people, and white people are powerful. And when I call them out, how can that be anti-Semitic? I'm not calling out the Jews as a caste. They're powerful. Israel is a powerful country in the Middle East. So they're not a victim. So when I say that the state of Israel should not exist, or when I slander the Jews as Nazis in the Middle East, that's not anti-Semitism. After all, they're powerful. Their whiteness. This is the real problem. The real problem here has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. The real problem here has to do with the redefinition of racism and discrimination itself. So racism and discrimination used to be you discriminate against a particular group of people based on an immutable characteristic. Then the left decided to add to that, and you have to be a member of a more powerful group. Racism plus power equals discrimination, according to the left. This is one of their clear redefinitions. It is not merely bigotry that is the problem. It's bigotry plus power that is the problem. Therefore, if you're a member of a marginalized group or a so-called powerless group, then bigotry is no longer something that you have to worry about. You can be as bigoted as you want to be. It's totally fine. In fact, in some ways, it's praiseworthy because you're fighting back against the hierarchy of power. That's truly ugly stuff. So if you're wondering about the upsurge in anti-Semitism, perhaps it's because we have an entire progressive wing that is essentially making excuses for anti-Semitism based on quote-unquote power dynamics. Alrighty, guys, the rest of the show is continuing right now. You're not going to want to miss it. We'll be getting into a global redistribution plan from the Biden administration, plus an economy about to be turned upside down. If you're not a member, click the link in the description and join us.